particular to one course or not in another. Okay, let's take 2 more comments or questions, and then I'm going to move on a little.
Okay, mine's more of a comment, I think. I would say that I'm a recent graduate and also been into lecturing recently. And because I have that very close approximation to being a student and also lecturing, I've noticed that the way that we assess really needs to change. So the weighting that we place on these end of course examinations need to change, because a whole lot of anxiety is placed on the student at that moment, and it's also based on needs. So we need to have some form of continuous assessment that actually counts, because at the end of the day the student goes, but this doesn't count as a weighting in my course, so why should I do that? So the distribution of weighting with all these different types of assessments needs to be compiled within that course outline.
Yeah, and talked about. And that's why made explicit, discussed with, not necessarily always negotiated with, but at least discussed with students, so there's a clear sense of the purpose of these things. I know that there will be concerns for some people around things like identity, who gets to do the assessment then, if it's a group assessment, who puts all the effort into the group assessment and so on. We've got to be wary of those kinds of things, and those are steps in the process. But that for me doesn't preclude our attention to why we do this, and a debate about how much of this course can be formative in terms of its orientation and how much of it can be summative. Again, we place too much emphasis on that summative snapshot view, I think. It carries high stakes purposes, and we make very high stakes claims on very thin evidence of that.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you so much for such an informative online assessment, because I've been critical of it, because
You've been critical?
Yes.
Yeah, good. I'm no online assessment evangelist, please. I haven't come with a flag waving for online assessment. In fact, I've thought about it very carefully, but I'm trying to say what are its affordances and what are its drawbacks. Sorry,
Okay. I've been critical because with me, I find it, I'm teaching in first year nursing students. When you look at those focuses, especially the affective, cognitive, and behavioral, normally we teach them, they are learning on integrating theory and practical.
Yes.
And it's first years, and it's a human life discipline, it's a life and death discipline. So you find that you need the affective and the behavioral to come on the theory, on your assessment. And it doesn't appear. And with the first year, you find that you need to emphasize on that, because it's a foundation for them to move forward. But once you do it online, you find that it doesn't come out, and it doesn't have enough space to evaluate or to assess how it's coming out from the student themselves. Or do they grapple, or do they understand what you are saying to them?
Okay, I'm not going to respond specifically without knowing more about what you're actually doing and how you're going about it. I would suspect that partly what it's about is looking at the form of assessment. So for me, making judgments about behavior really isn't going to emerge, and I'm not suggesting it isn't going to emerge out of a text-based assessment practice, for example, which many of my colleagues and I in the past and even in the present do mistakenly. So we think that if students write an analytical essay, that tells us something about how they might behave. So we've got to find an appropriate form of assessment, and I think again the online space could do that. We could have them. They could do a video recording. They could record a group process. But they need support, and they need rubrics, and they need feedback about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and the alignment between the purpose and the task. These things, that's what constructive alignment, I think, is telling us. We need a lot more talk about, discussion about, and thinking through what those alignments are. And again, back to my third point here, the claims we make on the basis of those alignments. So it needs an interrogation of what, and not necessarily only one kind of assessment, a range of assessment activities that together enable us to make a better claim on the cognitive, behavioral, affective values type levels. It's not... we can't be prescriptive here. What I'm trying to encourage in the discussion here is thinking about what we're doing and how we're doing it and whether it's the best way to do it. And therefore what the online space allows us and what the face-to-face space does. And conversely what the online space constrains. The literacies issue is an important issue in that I mentioned earlier. For some students, engagement in an online space is really difficult, troublesome, and demands a different kind of engagement to that is done in the face-to-face space. But it does allow us to have, I think, greater access into how students are participating. Are there students in the room today? Or is it all academics or lecturers and tutors and like, okay. I don't want to set up a thing about students versus, we versus they. Okay. So just a few more points about alignment and then looking at the online space, and I'm going to try and leave a goodly amount of time for discussion. The typology theory, I think, helps us to be really quite self-conscious and deliberate about how we plan assessment. Back to my point about making assessment part of the discourse of the discipline. So that there the onus is on us. To make sure that we achieve the purposes we really want to achieve with assessment. And what I'm suggesting through this kind of scheme here, and please, this is just an example, and it's just it's not a lattice, it's not meant to be taken exactly as is, but if we can think about assessment, both in the online and the face-to-face space, if we can think about assessment as about the relationship between what we're trying to assess, the kind of content or the focus of our assessment, and the kind of demand we might be placing on students in that space. Why I think this is particularly useful is this might serve a real function at the whole curriculum level or the first year student level, for example. We could arguably plot our assessment activity, formative and summative, on this kind of map, and where we could see, for example, the extent to which what we're doing is aligned from purpose to student learning to what we wanted to claim about that learning. So we could say, for example, at the first year level, the primary assessment demand at first year level, I'm just assuming here, might be recall and application. So we would expect our formative and summative tasks to be placed most predominantly in those spaces. We would less expect to be asking students to review or critique or evaluate. So I just want to be careful here because we don't want to sort of make it or essentialize it to be that first year student learning is all about recall and application, and it's only when you get to third or fourth year that you do any review and critique. It's going to change according to disciplines. But what I'm suggesting is if we're thinking about the demand we're placing on students in relation to the kinds of things that we expect them to do, then we can kind of plot, and we can use the online space to develop some of these competencies or some of these abilities for students. So if we know, for example, that we don't want examinations or summative assessment to be strongly recall focused, we can use the formative online, for example, space to do the recall activity and use the summative space to do more of the more, if you like, complex or multidimensional kinds of assessment. But knowing what it is we're trying to do and knowing what it looks like in each of our disciplines, which obviously will be different across all the range of people represented in the room, is really important. What does application mean in the context of my discipline, which is assessment and evaluation? How will I set a test or a task or an assignment that will best represent that? Do I want students, for example, to only be thinking about application? In my case, clearly not. I want them to be able to integrate the theory into a real-life practice context. So I might not even want them to do any writing at all. Because, and to come back to one of your earlier questions, ma'am, the question about how does this relate to, say, for example, the development of academic writing? Again, if we're going to set a task that is writing dependent or writing heavy, we need to be mediating the writing part of the task as well as the content part of the task. And their alignment, again, is really critical. So in an online space, we might be able to mediate some of that writing, the writing element in a highly developmental way, allowing students to do drafts of their writing online, perhaps writing only the introduction to an assignment online, giving them feedback, letting their peers give them feedback, etc., in a high developmental kind of space that is contributing to the improvement in their ability to write in the final, say, summative assessment place. Okay, so I'll leave that as an example and just suggesting that the usefulness of such a scheme is, first of all, it brings into a real conscious awareness of what we're trying to do in the assessment space, and then I think it also helps us to understand the kind of interplay between the demand we're placing on students and what we want in terms of the discipline, so that bringing those things into some kind of alignment and so on. But it can also help us with a kind of a planning stage around assessment activity too. Okay, so here are some of the things that I think we need to think about when we move into an online space in the assessment terms. I've raised some of these issues already. What do we want to assess? Are we assessing content? Are we assessing process? Is it predominantly a conceptual thing that we're trying to assess? The tasks would be different according to those different purposes, in my view. Of course, they will sometimes be integrated. Then there's the alignment issue. How do the assessment activities align with course objectives and so on? And we're not called upon as academics to give, if you like, give account of this, but I think it can help us to be much clearer about why we do assessment at all. What signals here? This is the weighting issue. What signals do assessments provide about the course and to students? So clearly, highly savvy students are going to look at the mark allocation in an assessment activity and say, I need to spend more time on these components because they carry weightings of, say, 25%, or they count 50 or 70% of the mark in the examination. Clearly, they're going to pay much more attention to that. What is the consequence of that? Is that what we want? Why do we weight things? What does the weighting tell the student? What does the weighting tell us about the value and importance of that particular assignment? And then I think really critically, and this comes back to my example about the written exam at the end of the course, what form of assessment is best suited to the purpose, the learning purpose that we want? The written essay clearly carries huge currency in the higher education environment. It's also really useful because it can be done at mass scale, for example, and so on and so on and so on. But it may not be the best form of assessment that we use. I'm not sure. We can probably talk about that further as we go along. Okay, let's pause there for a second if there are any more questions or comments or observations people want to make. And then I'm going to move into the online space directly. Yes, ma'am.
My question is really political justice. Formative assessment what are ways to ensure political just doing it for doing it?
Yeah. I mean, I think if we're going to practice formative assessment and it's not going to be for marks, then it requires, I suppose, some kind of discussion and debate among colleagues about what it's going to look like. My immediate reaction to that is to say it doesn't matter, but it will matter at some point, because at some point someone will want to give account of the formative activity they've introduced in a particular course. So it will matter. So at minimum, it's back to this kind of self-conscious stuff. So why am I doing this formative assessment? What are its different purposes? What roles does it play? Why am I not giving it marks? And that can be documented, and I think it should be documented. Not in an overly kind of prescriptive and rigorous, restrictive kind of way, but in a way that says this contributes to the impact of the course as a whole. So maybe that's where quality and quality assurance starts to play a role. The kind of self-conscious documentation, the contribution this makes to staff development in the institution and so on. But it's very difficult to say there's one kind of prescript that fits the whole institution. It will depend on it depends on disciplines and academics. But it's not only dependent on academics individually, because then it's going to be a kind of an idiosyncratic or very discipline-specific thing. So there's a role I think quality assurance can play in contributing to staff perceptions of best practice, for example. That's a real role that QA can play. What does it mean to do formative assessment? What are the best ways in which formative assessment can be practiced? But it takes the discipline as well. People will need to engage with these things in the discipline or the sub-discipline.
I'm really practical
Yeah.
regarding as an occupational therapist.
Mm.
And key thing for us is in terms of practical skills, functional skills. What are your thoughts on the conversion of OSCEs or online environment? Has been any thoughts of it?
Okay, just remind me what OSCE stand for.
For example,
Occupation specific. So what's the acronym stand for? Okay, objective setting in a clinical. Yeah.
so for example, how do you explain it practically?
Sure.
So we've got radio stations, right?
Yeah.
You want to assess a specific function, which is say strength. How does a patient
Yeah.
How does a student assess muscle strength of a patient with, just say, stroke? So, you put it at radio stations, they do a specific type of demonstration and do it on mark. In the online space, how do you see us doing something like that? Especially like that environment of feasible school.
Okay, and the most immediate that comes to my mind is making sure that that is recorded and placed online. So both the assessment activity and the practice, and I would say also ensuring that the feedback given to students in that environment is part of the recording, so that students can view it again. Beyond that, I would look to mediate that by saying, what did you notice in these different cases? Here are the scenarios, have a look at these different examples, and what did you notice in those spaces? You'd need to be careful, though, I suppose, about the formal thing, because if that's a formal examination against a professional standard, you'd need to think about the ethics of recording and who gets to see that recording, but it can be used, I think, very strongly in that way, as one example.
I must say, I've started the process
Yeah.
to keep those things online.
Yeah.
It's been very warm
Yeah.
in terms of person power,
Yeah.
cost, and time.
Sure.
And in terms of technology, also in terms of students downloading as well as they go, schools very
Agreed.
problematic. What is UCT or experience ways around
Yeah, no,
to access this?
this is a process. We can't move to this, from 0 to 100 in one move. So I would suggest start small, see where it is possible to do this kind of thing. Maybe just do one recording as a learning example that can be placed online. Make sure, for example, that when students view it, they can view it in a place where data is available to them. I mean, they not set up an expectation that they're going to do it, for example, at home, where they may not be able to find that example. Work it in class if necessary. I mean, I can see good examples of that discussion happening in a lecture room itself, so that there is bandwidth and there is an opportunity for students to engage. But not to move, in my view, not to move from, as I say, 0 to 100 in one step. It may only be practicable in one example, and that's going to take 20 hours of engagement and work to get that single example up there. But that's a start. The nice thing about that is it's an archive. It's not going to go away. It will be usable the following year too, and reusable.
So, Prof, I was just wondering if you could comment on how do we change students' perception, maybe students and staff, around traditional assessment? How do we change this culture of doing it differently?
Carefully. With difficulty. I'm not, like I said, this is not an easy approach. My view here, okay, it's born out of practice as well, but it's largely also aspirational and idealistic. I think this is important. I think this is how we should be thinking about assessment, but it's not going to happen overnight. It probably takes engagement and intervention at all the layers and levels of the institution. So you need champions in the institution. You need individual practitioners who are going to do this and model this behavior. You need the deans, for example. Are there any deans here today? No? Oh, good. Okay, thank you. Deans, I'm talking directly to you. You need the deans to support this, to give a signal that this is important work. To also give a signal that there are resources that can be provided for this important work, so that it's not just the responsibility of the individual academic to toil away developing these resources, but that there's some signal. the DVC, teaching and learning. You know, at every level, there needs to be some kind of important signal that says this is both useful work, important work, theoretically desirable work, good practice, supported in other cases, but also problematic. We've got to think about what are the problems and the difficulties too. But it needs that kind of engagement. It's not. It's nice when individuals take up these courses and work with them at the individual level, but many of those individuals burn out because they say, well, you know, I'm just doing this in a complete vacuum. Nobody's supporting me. I've produced this incredibly useful resource about, you know, occupational therapy assessment in a laboratory setting, and who cares? You know, nobody's supporting that. I'm not getting any kind of recognition for it. I might as well just continue my basic chalk and talk mechanisms. I need to see other... Okay, sorry, 2 more questions and then I'm going to move on again.
May I just add?
Yeah.
The intention should not be to change the conceptions or the perspectives, but to broaden our colleagues' perspectives.
Fantastic. Yes, present these as possibilities and opportunities. Do not present them as, you know, you're not doing this, so you better start doing it kind of stuff. Because that's, absolutely.
I think myself, I just want to make a comment. When you talk about something being driven from the top.
Yes.
But it can happen the other way too. It's about you doing what you believe will work and present whatever it is that you're doing. And those that are receptive, ideas grow.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, I've been in higher education long enough to know that iteration and reiteration are really important. You say the same thing many times over. People start getting tired of hearing the message. But somewhere along the line, perhaps there's a kind of an uptake or a receptivity to that message. But it requires resilience, it requires energy, it requires persistence to get there. Okay, I'm going to move on, a little bit directly into the online space here. And then I'm going to say, let's have 20 minutes or more, perhaps, at the end for proper discussion and commentary and so on. And maybe even a where to, what does this mean beyond this 2-hour conversation, which is on record. Okay, so what am I talking about in online space terms? And I mean, I don't know. What's the length of a piece of string? You could go. There are so many possibilities in the online space for engagement that can have both a strongly formative and summative purpose in assessment terms. And please, I want somebody to raise the question with us and discuss with us the question about, so what happens when we do place high-stakes assessment into an online space in relation to things like standards, security, and whether people can copy one another's work. We do need to talk about that stuff because it sits here as an important question. You can't just say, well, students are so good they're not going to try and cheat the system or whatever. We do need to talk about that. So it could be any of these things, it could be all or more. And other here could be things like social media. I know I have tried, unsuccessfully so far in the postgraduate space, to use social media for students to discuss issues that arise out of my lectures. They're too conservative, apparently. I'm talking about adult students in my particular context. It's also my fault because what I did was I simply put a task in a social media space and expected that a week later students would have responded in great depth to the questions I was asking them about the assessment activity. They didn't. And my fault, mea culpa, was I didn't follow up. I didn't provide a sort of sequenced, scaffolded, intentional intervention where on day 2 I said to students, "Boy, I noticed nobody's responded to my questions. Is there something wrong here? What's going on?" There needs to be some kind of intervention and monitoring of those online processes. We can't necessarily, what I learned was I can't necessarily just say, well, students have never done this before, now suddenly they're going to be immediately drawn to an online activity and just do it. Even postgraduate, even adult students in this particular case. They were still waiting for me to say, what's in